Hi, we're on to chapter 5, titled After the End, From Being While Knowing That You're Not. And I write, I never wrote anything after September of 2005, and after reflecting back on what was going on at that time in my life, it made perfect sense why I would quit writing just then. This was the very same month that our daughter brought home her first pug, Kaya. I was adamant that I did not want any dogs, and I even let my daughter cry for 2 days earlier before I finally caved in and let us have the pug. But it would only be a short time later that I too fell under the spell of this adorable creature and insisted that we find another pug to be Kaya's companion. While the first pug looks and acts like your typical pug, the partner that she picked out, Bodhi, was anything but your typical pug. He looks and behaves more like a Boston Terrier, who are very active dogs compared to the typical lazy pug. Bodhi demands a long walk out in the mountains every day at 8:30 in the morning, come rain or shine. I too am very lazy by nature, but I soon fell in love with these daily walks, so much that we would start spending more and more time exploring different trails behind our property. The properties that adjoin mine are a farm, an apple orchard, and a bridge that leads to the National Forest. My neighbors are kind enough to let me walk my pugs, which at this point had become 4 pugs, on their property, and one of their dogs, a huge Labrador that always joined us on our walks. So to this day, every morning we start our hike down the driveway and descend down the mountain and follow the various trails along the creeks and hollows that stretch out endlessly in every direction. We spend as little as an hour and as much as 4 hours discovering new trails every single day of the year, and we still haven't even scratched the surface of potential areas to explore. Because the areas around us, all of our neighbors owned miles of land. And they never used them because, like I said, there were farms and orchards and national forests, so this was unused land. Not even really any trails except for deer trails. I soon became addicted to hiking in the forest and realized that I was spending more time roaming these mountains than I spent in any other single room except for the sleep lab that I worked in. This particular mountain range behind my house had become my new room, or rather the scenery which would dominate the landscape of my daily life. Being a product of suburbia, I have never been an outdoorsman my whole life, but now I have found myself admiring the host of outdoor television programs like Man vs. Nature, Survivor Man, so on and so forth. These guys were truly at one with their environment in a way that I've never known. As much as I felt these mountains to be my home, I knew that on my own, I wouldn't last a winter in my own backyard. My wife, who had loved camping since we first met in 1990, saw our day hikes as an opportunity to camp out overnight. So we soon found ourselves taking up the hobby of backpacking. There are countless trails that surround the section of the Appalachian Trail that runs through our neighborhood, so every weekend we could explore a new trail. Actually, with our GPS device, we find ourselves exploring off the trail so that we could set up a camp where the pugs won't disturb fellow hikers camping out for the night. It was around this time, 2006, 2007, that I reached what I felt to be my domestic peak. Each day with my family unfolded so perfectly that it felt like a dream that I was making up myself. As a sleep tech, I only have to work 3 days a week, so my weekends felt like little vacations in the mountains. We would explore the area during the day and come in at night to play games and watch America's Funniest Home Videos, while the pugs ran around attacking each other and the TV every time an animal appeared on the TV. Every after having so many successive nights that I felt to be the absolute perfect day, I was feeling like I'd gotten everything out of the domesticated human experience that is possible. I had what I felt to be the perfect family life, the perfect job, the perfect home, and the perfect area, etc., etc. And it should be pointed out that what I mean by perfect is not a comparison to what anybody else or any other idea, but rather the feeling that I couldn't imagine anything better than it already was for myself. I remember telling my wife that if anything ever happened to her and my daughter, that I would not want to start another family. I felt so fulfilled by the life that I had with my family that I just didn't think I would have the desire to do it again if I was given the chance. In other words, I felt like I just reached the peak on this. And it was like, I don't think I'd have the feeling to do it again. I just feel like I just did it to perfection, and I wouldn't be feeling like I had to do that again. I joked that if I were to lose them, then I would walk into the forest and live off of roasted squirrel until I died. But there was a deep part of me that didn't think that that was a joke. As convenient and comfortable as it is for me to be connected to the grid, the more I spent time in the mountains, the more I felt a pull to just drop out and live off the land. The fact that I do have a family makes it a non-issue altogether, as even my pugs would revolt if I seriously entertained the notion of living off the land. But even if I didn't have a family, the sad truth is that I am completely naive about even the most basic outdoor survival skills. Although I didn't kid myself for a second that I actually could survive living out in the wild, I couldn't deny that there was a strange pull to make the outdoors my official residence. It wasn't just the natural beauty of the wild that drew me deeper into the mountains. I also enjoyed the authenticity that I didn't find in the human dimension. And I'm not saying that people are phony or anything cliche like that. In fact, the only phoniness that ever got my attention was my own phoniness. I had gotten so used to lying to everyone that I ever encountered that it was just a way of life. When I went from talking about the true nature of our existence every waking moment of my life to avoiding the subject altogether because it was just too overwhelming to wrap my mind around anymore, I had unwittingly chose a life as a liar. I didn't set out to live as a liar. It was a very slippery slope. It started with an honest discussion about anything. It starts with an honest discussion about anything having to do with life. And as ideas are flushed out in the course of the conversation, the issue gets whittled down to a core perspective. And because the non-dual perspective is so fundamentally different than the conventional dualistic perspective, I end up sounding like a total nut job, saying things like Hitler is worthy of our love or something else equally insane. There are only so many times that you can have a conversation like that until you feel so alienated that it just becomes easier to say, "Oh, I see your point. There are some people that are deserving of our hate, and it is fine to allow this hate to fester. I get it." Of course, I don't actually say this, but by not voicing my true perspective, I may as well be saying that. So, by 2008, I was getting tired of living life as a phony, and I expressed this to all my family and friends. Everybody seemed to empathize with me, especially those that were over 40. It seems that everyone I talked to had a similar story about getting sick of all of our polite lies that we use on a daily basis just to avoid feeling uncomfortable for the moment. So it seemed like a struggle for a while, as if I had a long-standing habit that I needed to break. But then something happened that reminded me that all of our perceived struggles are just part of a natural cycle that can be trusted implicitly. Somewhere early in 2010, after I had just turned 40 years old, I noticed that the impulses to lie or act phony for the sake of trying to make someone else feel comfortable simply dropped away on its own. After all of the contemplation, all of the mental wrangling that would come and go for the last couple years, the whole thing just resolved itself without any struggle necessary. It reminded me that everything is developing naturally in its own time. And what I deemed to be a struggle was actually just a natural stage of human growth and development that predictably takes place around the age of 40. It reminded me that we may impose on our experience a sense of being a person with choices and struggles, but ultimately we are just witnessing the process of our own evolution. What I discovered on the other side of 40 was that the motive for lying to others may be experienced as a desire to spare the feelings of others from feeling uncomfortable. But what lies underneath of that motive is the secret motive to spare yourself from your feelings that you get when you imagine how the other person must be feeling, according to your imagination. So, when you realize that it's actually about you, it makes it easier to face those uncomfortable feelings because it is no longer abstract, but something that you could experience for yourself. Whereas prior to 40, I felt like any form of sharing my thoughts that arrived from the non-dual perspective was a form of interfering with others. After 40, I was beginning to see that my aversion to sharing this perspective with others was the actual interference, simply because I was censoring myself, withholding myself, blocking myself. The more I began to share of myself and my perspective, the more I realized how the non-dual perspective is not just a path to enlightenment, but also a path to happiness, understanding, and just plain old sanity. For the last decade, I didn't feel like I was ever withholding information because no one I know has any interest in pursuing enlightenment. But when you see the information that you have can actually be helpful to someone's sense of well-being, then you do feel like you are withholding information when you just sit there listening to someone who is stating their complaint, knowing that there is something that you could share that could very well alleviate their suffering. That is when I began to get the inspiration to write this book, or the first book. It's not that I never thought of writing a book about my spiritual journey. In fact, over the last decade, there have been several times that I decided that I wanted to write a book about all my spiritual revelations. I originally wanted to write a book just so I could share it with people I knew and other kindred spirits that I've never met, so that I wouldn't feel so alienated. But I suppose that wasn't enough motivation because I didn't do it. Sometime after that, I went through a phase where I was listening to roots reggae, and I was moved by the overtly religious lyrics, which inspired a call to arms, to speak out against ignorance, or use your God-given voice to speak the truth. But again, this was not enough to inspire me to actually do anything. It wasn't enough to inspire me to write the book. There was even one time I remember I just needed some quick cash and I thought about writing a book. But as usual, nothing happened because nothing could motivate me. As many times as I wanted to write this book, I simply was never able to. I would love to have some profound and prophetic or poetic reason that I could give to explain why I finally did decide to write this book. But the truth is that there was no special moment or epiphany. As my daughter had been getting older, our conversations related to spirituality had been getting deeper, and I gradually realized the need to organize my thoughts because I hadn't talked about any of this stuff for so long. She would really take me to task and challenge me hard on all of my assertions when I did bring up this stuff. And eventually I realized that I needed to figure out a way to build my case from the beginning, if there was a beginning at all. The best way I could think about imparting my perspective to her was to simply share with her the entire path of self-discovery from the very beginning. And that's what the first book was. I want to make a point to say that I don't think that it is necessarily important if my daughter or anyone else develops an interest in pursuing enlightenment. As a matter of fact, I think enlightenment is an accident, a crapshoot at best. However, I am convinced that the path of enlightenment or non-dual wisdom provides self-verifiable truths that will bring a profound sense of love and wonder to anybody's existence or to anybody's daily experience. The perspective from which we see ourselves shapes the way that we experience the world. The degree in which you feel conflicted with the world or reality is a direct reflection of how conflicted you are internally. So the bottom line is that if you want to feel a sense of harmony with the world, then you must come to know your true nature. And I want to go back to that sentence. The perspective from which we see ourselves shapes the way that we experience the world. And we hear that in quotes all the time because it's true, but we hear it in different ways. I've heard it in forms, the way we see the world, or the way we see God is the way we see ourselves, or the way we see the world is the way we see ourselves. Or if you want to change the world, be the changes you want to see in the world. That truth comes up again because it is our perspective that shapes the way we see the world. Confirmation bias would be a scientific way of saying the same thing. All right, so when I recently shared some of this book with my daughter, who was 15 at the time of this writing, now she's not 24, her first question was, why do you care about any of this? Talk about taking the wind out of my sails. It's funny because no matter how much I may consider the mystery of life to be endlessly fascinating, her question was a sobering reminder of how the study of reality, ironically, comes across as being so removed from our daily life. But as abstract and conceptual as this investigation into reality may seem, the truth is that each of us experiences the everyday world through the prism of our understanding of reality, whether we realize it or not. I reminded her of an analogy that I used in the past, which seemed to have made the deepest impression on her. The analogy that I used was to liken God/reality to a body of water. I told her to imagine that God/reality, or this body of water, is all there is. So God is all alone, or all one, all alone. But if God, or this body of water, were to stir itself up, it would transform itself from an undifferentiated body of perfectly clear water to a sea of frothy foam, frothy bubbles endlessly. Now there's no clear water. Now it's all foam. You can't even see the water. All you see is the bubbles, the edges, the borders, the boundaries, the differences. The water, or God/awareness, would not be alone anymore, as awareness/water would find itself as each distinct aware bubble, interacting with all the other aware bubbles. each aware bubble would naturally take itself to simply be an individual aware bubble instead of the awareness/water itself. The reason that I reminded her of this analogy was to point out that if you mistake yourself to simply be a single bubble of awareness instead of the water/awareness itself, then you'll experience your life as a desperate struggle to avoid the annihilation that the inevitable bursting of your bubble/awareness will bring. Whereas if you recognize your true nature to be the water/awareness itself, then your life will be experienced with a sense of ease and faith in the gradual unfolding of time. I've read several variations like this when others have tried to describe the relationship between the one and the many. But in every example I have heard, it's always alluded to that the one somehow decided or intended to fragment itself for one reason or another. I may have even unwittingly alluded to a sense of choice in my example of water transforming into and as bubbles. But from my perspective, I actually don't see choice or any other form of intention coming into play. I would say that in this example, the very nature of water is to move, so it would necessarily and unavoidably churn itself into bubbles effortlessly and spontaneously. In other words, the world that we're experiencing right now is not something that was decided on, but rather an inevitable consequence of the very nature of reality. And that's something that I'm very much looking forward to expanding on in my third and final book on the triune, because that's when I go into the relationship between the one and the many, the relationship between mind and matter, why I say reality had to be, that there was no choice, the very nature of it had to be, so many different dynamics. That's what I'm truly mostly excited about. That's the only reason I've ever gotten into any of this. So I only have one more chapter left. The final chapter, chapter 6, next week. I think I'm going to title it, I'm not even quite finished with it, but I think I'm going to title it Funeral in My Head. Chapter 6. So that's it. All right. Have fun. See you guys next week. Toodaloo.